I'm going to go over some practice ACT reading questions. I'm going to go ahead and read over the directions so that when you're actually taking the ACT, you know what they are and you don't need to spend time reading them. So, in the passage that follows, certain words and phrases are underlined and numbered. In the right-hand column, you will find alternatives for the underlined part. In most cases, you are to choose the one that best expresses the idea, best expresses being the operative word. There might be two that are very similar. Makes the statement appropriate for standard written English or is worded most consistently with the style and tone of the passage as a whole. If you think the original version is best, choose no change. In some cases, you will find in the right-hand column a question about the underlined part. You are to choose the best answer to the question. You will also find questions about a section of the passage or about the passage as a whole. When you find a section of the passage or a passage as a whole, you want to skip those questions to the end. So either until the end of that paragraph or the end of the passage. Don't try to answer it in the middle. That's the best use of your time. These questions do not refer to an underlined portion of the passage, but rather are identified by number or numbers in a box. For each question, choose the alternative you'd consider best and fill in the corresponding oval on your answer document. Read the passage through once before you begin to answer the questions that accompany it. When they say read it before, I wouldn't spend a long time reading it. I'd read the first sentence of each paragraph because the topic sentence usually does the main point of the paragraph and skim the rest so you have an idea. The ACT goes really fast, so don't spend a ton of time with reading that's not purposeful. For many of the questions, you must read several sentences beyond the question to determine the answer. Be sure that you have read far enough ahead each time you choose an alternative. So, I already answered the questions. But the first one's really tricky because it's an obscure semicolon rule. I grew up with buckets, shovels, and nets waiting by the door, semicolon, hip waders hanging in the closet, semicolon, tied table charts covering the refrigerator door, and a microscope was sitting on the kitchen table. So this comes with questions 1 and 2 already there. The thing is, normally, a semicolon separates two independent clauses or complete sentences. However, if you have lists with commas in the same entity, like you can see here, so we have bucket, shovels, and net, so 3 things waiting by the back door. But all of this counts as one. In order to avoid confusion, because then we have one thing in the closet, so items, back door, item, closet. The commas could create confusion if we just separated these items in a list with commas. For that reason, you use a semicolon to separate each entity. Not many people know that rule. Initially, when I was doing number 1, I selected I'm waiting by the back door, comma. However, once I realized that it was a list with commas in this first section, I realized that it was no change. Okay, also if you go to the ACT website, you can click and see why the best answer is A. Okay, and yeah, see it says semicolons, items in a series. Okay, and this way you can get instant feedback. And the microscope was sitting on the kitchen table. The reason we don't need the was and it's just sitting is because nets waiting, hip waders hanging. So we don't have any was. So for parallelism purposes, all you need is the sitting, you don't need the was. So that's why it's important to pay attention to the grammar of a sentence. Having studied, my mother is a marine biologist. That's just a really poorly constructed sentence, so you should know something's up with that from the beginning. So if you switch it around, my mother is a marine biologist having studied, it's like, well, that doesn't really make sense. So we want to state that that's my mother's profession. So for number 3, my mother is a marine biologist. Just because it's the simplest doesn't mean it's incorrect. As my mother's interest is science, she is a marine biologist. Yes, but we don't need all that information. And then my mother's occupation is that of a marine biologist. That's also correct, but it's a little bit wordier. And usually, in today's day and age, we prefer things to be shorter. Okay? So which word choice would most effectively introduce the rest of the paragraph? And this is for number 5. Everything was subservient to the disposal of the tides. So this is an example of the writer trying to sound educated by using big words. So everything was subservient or like a servant to the tide, like the ocean. And you just don't really say that. It's awkward. Usually you're subservient to a person. And disposal, it's not really, again, the right word. So we know number 5 is going to be different. The correct answer is depended on. Everything depended on the tides. Oh, did I skip one? I did. Because you're not defenseless against the tides, and you don't trust in the tides. So that's why number 5 is that one. For number 4, this is what's tricky. Is when you're going back and forth, sometimes you can skip questions, so be careful not to do that. Our household might have been described as uncooperative. Our meals weren't always served in the expected order of breakfast, lunch, and supper. Uncooperative doesn't describe what follows, so the meals not being served in the correct order isn't uncooperative. It just means it's unorthodox or different. So I, without checking, thought unorthodox. So let's go to number 4. There is not an unorthodox option. It's not that there's no explanation for why the household runs the way it does. There is. The mom is a marine biologist. She wants to be around when the waves change or something. Okay? Our household didn't run according to a typical schedule. Well, considering breakfast, lunch, and supper are different, that could be an answer option, which it is. Mom ran our household in a most spectacular manner. That alludes to an idea that the household is run differently, but in a very good, amazing way. And what follows is kind of an odd thing, right? The household doesn't run as most do. So that's why G is the correct answer. We already did number 5. And those are the 5 questions for that passage. So hopefully, there are more, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how you should tackle a passage when you're talking about grammar and why it's so important to pay attention. Now, you can't read these passages out loud when you're taking the test, but hopefully you hear your own voice in your head as you go over these, because that will really help you slow down and think, does this sentence make sense? Does this passage make sense? And I hope you found this to be useful.